Hello, hello, peace lovers, peacemakers, peace builders. Welcome to Peace Mindedly. I am Sarah Jamshidi, and we are doing another episode with another amazing author for Peace Mindedly. Today we are talking about parenting with an accent, how immigrants honor their heritage, navigate setbacks, and chart new paths for their children. This is the title of the book by Masha Rumer. If you are like me or like our authors, although I have to confess that I believe our authors, at least to my ear, do not speak the language, English language, with too much accent, unlike myself. But if you are like us, you want your kids to learn about your language and your tongue. So then you can use the language as a vehicle to transport culture, traditions, and the values that is really dear to you within your own culture, the culture that you've grown up. As I was reading the book, and I learned that our author really wants her kids to learn more about Russia and about Russian culture, about what's going. I mean, everything about Russia. Although I must say that there is so much going on. I mean, we are bombarded by the news about Russian invasion of Ukraine. Our guest also has footsteps within Ukraine. Lots of, war news of Russia and what's happening in the Ukraine. Nevertheless, all of us know that Russia did not created by Putin, and it's not going to be disappeared after Putin is gone. So this is an ancient country with ancient history, ancient culture, and it's going to survive and move on as many of the other cultures and other countries. Russia is not the only culture Masha talks about. They are Iranian culture, Korean culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, many other culture that she touches in her book. Masha Rumer is an award-winning journalist and freelance writer. Her work has appeared on New York Times, the Washington Post, Quartz, the Moscow Time, again my accent, Moscow Time, and many other publications. In this book, Parenting with an Accent, Masha shares many ways immigrants honor their heritage and identities. She talks and interviewed with more than 60 people, some of them experts, but mostly parents, to figure out how she can help herself to reconnect with her kids, with her children, and connect them to this beautiful Russian culture. I am bringing Masha to our screen. Hello, Masha.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Peace Mindedly. It's an honor to speak to you.
Absolutely, it's an honor to have you. Masha, what would you love your kids to learn about Russian culture? What are these significant major aspect of Russian culture or Russian culture that you would like your children to know?
It's, it's really has changed a lot in the past 3 months. Obviously, it's impossible to not talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Um, so my family is actually it's part Ukrainian. Half of my family has lived in Ukraine for generations. I was born in Russia. My relatives now, many of them were born in Ukraine too, and actually some even had to evacuate and flee Ukraine when the invasion began. So they had to run away with their family and their child. So it's and my family currently lives in Russia is actually, some of them have been arrested and jailed for the protests. So that, I mean, I wanted to just put it out there because it's such a tremendous, traumatic and difficult time. I'm hoping that the war will end soon and Ukraine starts to rebuild herself as soon as possible. But my what I would really like my kids to take away from my culture is obviously not this. Although we talk about the war very openly since it began, and they've been participating in fundraising, which I'll mention later. I'd like them to know the language of my ancestors, and to be able to speak it. I'd like them to respect the family and the elders. I'd like them to know the food that's, both Ukrainian and Russian, that I grew up with, and to feel connected to so many people that came before them that they've never even met before, whether they live in Belarus or Ukraine or Russia right now. And hopefully in more peaceful times, they can get to do that.
Yes, hopefully more peaceful times. Masha, do you think that they can learn any of this without learning Russian language?
It's really hard. That's a question I asked myself in the book when I set out to write it. Of course, it's possible to um, understand a culture without necessarily understanding the language, but you only get to know so little, because to truly connect with the people and to understand how they think and to read the literature, um, the language is really imperative. Although I realize that so many of us as parents who have immigrated to this country struggle with passing the language on to our kids. And some of us are lucky or have the support that, our kids are growing up bilingual or trilingual, which is amazing, but it's actually very challenging. Particularly the reading and the writing aspect. So I just want to make sure to be inclusive and say that, yes, language is very important for cultural understanding, but it all
Language and,
depends.
in my opinion, food.
Yeah.
So my grandma emigrated from Russia to Azerbaijan in Iran,
Oh,
and
wow.
then it was during the communism and Bolsheviks, and she used to make very delicious foods, soups like borscht, or it was a special kind of pirashka. Of course, pirashka is very famous, but it was a special. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing it right. She called it khingar or khinger. And then it was with like a dumpling, a Russian dumpling, and it was absolutely delicious. I mean, from the start to the end, they're very labor time consuming, but at the end, very delicious food. So, what is your favorite dish in Russia, and what is your favorite dish in Ukraine, and how do you say them in Russian?
Well, that first of all, I didn't realize that that's your background, Sarah. That's great. My favorite dish, well, actually, right now I have borscht on the stove cooking. It's a recipe from my grandmother, who I usually make tons of it. In fact, I have a really huge pot, but I was thinking of getting a bigger pot because when I make it, I tend to either invite people, tricky with the pandemic, or share it with others, or just save it for a family. Um, it's a recipe from my grandmother, who was born in Vinnytsia, Ukraine, and actually had to leave her country during World War II when she was a teenager because of the German army, the Nazi army that was coming, and part of my family was unfortunately killed during that war. So that's my kids love it. Beets were some of the favorite first foods that they started eating as babies, and it's hard to say what. There's so many others. I like to make rye bread that I grew up with. I've learned to make it also during the pandemic. My grandmother also taught me how to make uh, pirashki, which are, like you said, the intensive kind of dumplings that that you bake. But also there's a version called pilmeni or vareniki, which is Ukrainian. That just depends on the shape and the filling. I tend to just buy them. I don't have the time to make them. But food is incredibly important. Tea drinking, it's very important for my family as well.
Yes. What is the beat test? Chapter
Oh,
3.
oh my goodness.
Since we're talking about beats.
The bead test. That so bead test is the name of one of my chapters. In fact, it's hard to believe, but it's a chapter about dating and relationships. In the chapter, and the book itself describes my own journey as an immigrant and as a parent in America, having come here when I was 13 as a refugee from the former Soviet Union. And when I you know, when I started dating, I was kind of trying to figure out, who would I get along with. And one of the things that I did is so unintentionally is for me, food was really important. So I would invite at some point people to try the food that I grew up with. And sometimes people kind of made fun of it. And I found that a little bit offensive. I mean, obviously, you don't want someone making
But
fun of
they
your
had to
culture.
pass test.
Did not pass. No, fail. But it's not just about the food, right? Because there are many things that we find strange, and maybe about other cultures. I still cannot eat the peanut butter jelly sandwich. My husband thinks it's a meal. I
But
do not.
you did with your kid at some point when he was, she was, is it, I'm sorry, but she was
One of them.
refusing to eat
Yeah,
the dinner and then wanted to eat peanut butter jelly, and you joined her.
I did. I'm slowly warming up to it. I'm not, yeah, but it took me a while. I think usually I grew up in a culture where soup can cure any ill. It's almost like a medicine. So it has to be hot. You have to serve food as a first course. I mean, the soup, and then everything else. But like a sandwich is something you eat, right? As I grew up in Eastern Europe, like when you're going like hiking, maybe, or when you're doing some manual labor outside and you can't get some hot food.
Mhm,
So that to me took some time getting used to. But going back to the bead test, food is
mhm,
very important in my culture because people in the Soviet Union were growing up with lots of scarcity. My family growing up in Ukraine went through famine called Holodomor in the 1930s when Stalin basically starved millions of Ukrainians. Unfortunately, millions perished by taking away their grain. So my family's lived through that. Then obviously there was World War II. I had family that lived in Leningrad during the siege, where you just had a few ounces of bread per day. And also because the city was surrounded by the Nazis and all the food supplies were cut off. And later, even growing up, I remember food was so cherished because that we didn't really have a lot of it. We had this cookbook that had these scrumptious images, drawings of recipes, but you couldn't buy those things at the store. So we had a lot of beets, potatoes, onions, bread that we used, and we had to ration it, and sometimes even have coupons to make sure that we had enough. So to me, this ability to have respect for the food and the work that goes into it and the innovativeness is really important. So the beat test kind of somewhat jokingly goes through that. How people made fun of it, and eventually I took my husband to a Russian restaurant in New York in Manhattan, and then I'm not going to give away too much, but we are married. In fact, today's our anniversary, so needless to say, he passed the test. Right,
he passed the test.
right.
Amazing. Congratulations for your anniversary.
Thank you.
Excellent. That's amazing. But yes, I know that he passed the test, and his response to was very shocking to you. And of course, he passed the test. I'm not going to give out the details because it's a very delicious chapter second, chapter 2. Here's my question. So at least I would say that I speak English with an accent, and now I am in this kind of more confident capacity to laugh at my accent. Or when I am in a group, I say that, "Oh, you didn't understand this, ho ho ho." So I'm just repeating this same sentence. Or my daughter comes to me and corrects me for the wrong pronunciations, and I'm okay with that. But at the end, I tell her, "Sweetheart, at least I speak another 3 languages and you don't." But she
Right.
does, she speaks Farsi, but she speaks Farsi very fluently, but only one more language. But here's my take. Would you believe, or would you think, at least it's my impression, that after George Floyd and after the murder, the United States, not entirely, but has become more cautious about their attitude towards others, towards other people. We have lots of diversity inclusion department had opened up in many agencies, many government capacities, in many companies. I'm not going to go into detail to just explain whether or not this is really effective or is it for just a marketing piece. But my impression is that lately, at least within the last 1-2 year, I see some changes towards people's accent, of more accepting. I'm just curious.
Oh, so I really love this question, Sarah, and there's obviously so much to say and to talk about here. I'd like to think, yes, there's conscious change on behalf of you know, companies, organizations, and just the way people's mentality to be more open, and not to have this, the mentality that tends to be more, white Protestant, kind of middle class mentality that's been, I would say, the norm for, when we talk about assimilation or acculturation, since people started coming to the United States. Even, we have, even in the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin was railing against the Germans because they had, they looked different to them, and they spoke a different language and had different customs. He said they were bringing their worst, people. So this kind of mentality of, cautiousness and some discrimination against difference, including towards immigrants, has been part of American history. It repeated many times. With 1882, we had, Chinese immigration was outlawed in the United States. Then there was a huge push of nativism and this like anti-immigrant mentality at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, where Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, people from the former Russian Empire, Poland, Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Greek immigrants were considered to be different culture, different language, different values, obviously financially not as well because they are immigrants, right? And there were a huge series of laws that eventually like choked off immigration even until the 60s. It dropped drastically, starting in the early 20s and for the decades to come. And we obviously see that with civil rights and obviously discrimination and racism that unfortunately pervades many aspects of our society today. There is obviously change. I think a lot of it depends on also where we live, but we can even see that in the voting, access, and a whole variety of other laws that I won't even get into right now, and access towards medical care, etc. Uh, um, but at the same time, there has been a change, a positive change. I'd like to think people are making conscious effort, to be more open. I have an accent too, and certainly when I moved here, I had some backlash against me, and my family experienced that too. And I for a while even hid that I was an immigrant and tried to hide that I speak another language. But then eventually I kind of took ownership of it. Yes, I have an accent. Yes, I'm from somewhere else. And it's something that I'm proud of. And even writing this book made me more proud. If I may just say one more thing, in publishing, even like before the George Floyd murder, what happened is that there was a book that came out called American Dirt, which was supposed to be this all, hailed and marketed to be this great book about immigration, but it was written by an American-born person, who was never an immigrant, and at the same time, she was talking about an immigrant from, I believe it was Mexico or Central America. I think it was Mexico. At the same time, there are so many Latina and Latinx writers describing this experience, and their voices have not been, as promoted by the publishing industry as hers. So that caused a big splash. And I haven't read the book, so I can't comment on its merits. But there's, I would say, a lot more attention to immigrant literature and immigrant writing, which I think is great and incredibly important, considering we have the greatest number of immigrants living in this country in the history of this country.
Yes, what I really like about the book and how you are explaining all of those issues is its research and its background about what's been said, and then there is a story about the information or story, personal story of people that you are talking with. So I wonder which one of the stories that you really, really enjoyed.
Oh, it is so hard to answer because, as you mentioned, I spoke to more than 60 people for this book. Most of them are immigrants, most of them are parents, although not all are parents. And to be honest, I treated every interview as almost like a child. I coddled it, I listened and reviewed my notes over and over. I wanted to make sure that the name appears the way they wanted to appear, because some of the names have been changed, to protect the privacy of the person, and it says so in the very beginning of the book. But not all names. It all depends on what the person chose. I really just so I mean, so many. For example, one story that really resonated with me was a girl who came from Iraq. She is of Chaldean faith, so she's Christian, and she described to me how she settled with her family in outside of Detroit, which is a home to a large Chaldean population, and she experienced the bullying um, when she came. She remembers even being confronted at a supermarket with her mom for speaking Arabic. The woman was angry. I think it was just one of the examples. Like, why are you saying this? Why are you speaking this language? We're in America now, so why don't you just shape up and speak English? And it's not that they didn't speak English. I mean, her mom maybe didn't, but her father did. And they made a really conscious effort to speak the languages to their children because that's what made them fluent. So that was incredibly heart-wrenching. I've spoken to a man who was from Mexico, who married to a white American woman in Utah who works as a nurse, and he described some of the discrimination he's experienced, except he didn't want to really talk about it. He'd start talking about it and then just say, oh, but it happens to everybody. Oh, but it's not a big deal. Or, oh, it's okay. This tendency we have of kind of not wanting to make a splash, not wanting to recognize those complex experiences and feelings. But his wife would then jump in and say, well, actually, no, this was a problem. And this is exactly what happened.
Yes, I remember Amira, then
Yeah,
that how her
Amira.
dad really made a very conscious choice of only speaking Arabic at home.
Yeah.
And then later she wanted her kids to be fluent in both languages and then not just carry many of the stereotypes or many of the behaviors that is predominant within the culture. So, can you tell me about Amira? What happened to her?
Yes. So Amira was the woman that I mentioned who came from Iraq when she was a
Oh, this is the
toddler.
same
This is the same
toddler.
person.
Uh huh. Uh huh.
Yes. So
Uh huh.
she says she honors her. I mean, she honors her family. She is a big part of the community. Um, and Amira is not her real name. I'd use that to protect her identity, and that's what she asked me to do, obviously. And when she grew up, she realized that she identified with feminist ideals. She considered herself a feminist and a liberal. And there came a time, as happens, I think, for a lot of parents of young kids, that she had to find childcare for her daughters. And that's when she had the option of, choosing a daycare near home, an American daycare, because possibly, it's hard sometimes to find availability or even access to childcare from our culture. Or she could leave her kids in the care of her parents, who at that point were no longer working and who said, we can watch your kids, which is great, right? It's, you transmit the culture that way. You trust them, you know what they're going to do. It's free, which is also nice. And the kids stay with the family. A lot of, you know, kids grow up like grandparents have been caretakers for generations, for millennia, for so many families around the world. But she hesitated because she did not appreciate or approve of some of the practices that she saw in her community, where she felt women were not, were being demeaned. She was not allowed to date or wear makeup when she was younger, but the young men could do that. And if they were dating, that was considered fine. But for a girl, it was a huge taboo. And she did not like eating last at the table after the men. Those types of examples. And she explained this to her daughters, but she decided, I'm going to send them to preschool that's American instead of having her parents watch the kids and pass those values to her. So as a result, she's raising them with her values and beliefs, very progressive, but at the same time, she is, kind of heartbroken or at least upset that they're not as fluent as she would have wished they were in Arabic and Chaldean.
Yes. Bear with me. I need to adjust my tables. 1 second. Bear with me. Very good. You are watching and listening to Peace Mindedly, a podcast featuring peaceful bridge makers. For this hour, we are talking with Masha Rumer, author of Parenting with Accent. Parenting with an Accent. For this hour, we're talking with Masha Rumer, author of Parenting with an Accent. There you go, I got it. To listen to this show and to watch the show and to learn about this show and our conversation with Masha, go to goldtoon.com. And this is the season 5 of Peace Mindedly that we are putting together the programs and episodes for you to listen. In her book, Masha writes, there is no formula for raising immigrant kids or for rebuilding a home from scratch in the new lands. She opens the book with her own experience of communication troubles, as she was explaining to us that okay, in the school, what kind of trauma or difficulties she has had, or the kind of as an immigrant, someone who is not really fluent at the beginning, at least not very fluent with the language, the kind of trouble that we go into. And then a peer judgment, of course, arriving to California with her family as a teenager from the former Soviet Union. It was during the early 1990s. Then she digs in the book, she digs in and tells the stories of immigrant parents who make choices to raise their children in the United States. And these parents mostly make choices to teach the language, their native language to their kids. Okay, so there is a story in the book. I think it's chapter 10 or 11 that they were speaking Amharic or something like that. I can't exactly remember the detail, but teacher Odase decided to take charge of the school in his mosque or his church and teach the kids their native language. What is the story?
Yes. So I traveled to I traveled to a number of places to write the book because the best way I feel is to convey the sense of the place and the people is just by actually going there and describing it and experiencing it. So I went to an Amharic church, Ethiopian church. I'm Amharic language. Ethiopian church, right outside of New York City. And I got to the opportunity to attend an Amharic class for kids with the teacher there. So the teacher was actually a parent, a volunteer, and they used to have a teacher for the community to teach Amharic to the kids, but the teacher left and there was nobody there. But this man had 3 young kids. Maybe at the time he only had 2, but he has 3 now. And he drove a cab during the day in the city in New York. And he was really struggling with teaching the language to the kids because he knew, just like a lot of us as immigrants finding out, that it's very hard to transmit the language. Even if we speak it at home, especially if just one parent speaks it at home. So he one time went to an Egyptian Coptic church to a meeting or to one of the classes, and he said, "Wow, this is amazing! They have this whole program for kids to learn the language, and I really want to do the same thing at my church." So he got together with the church elders. They had a meeting, and they discussed starting a new teaching program on Sunday. So every Sunday after services and after lunch, maybe during lunch, they go and they have kids at different levels, at different ages, and the volunteers teach the kids Amharic, not just playing songs, but also to teach them to read and write, which is
serious teaching.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I got to speak to him and attend the class. And obviously he struggles because during the class, some of the girls would start speaking in English. And then another teacher that was my contact came in, Zuditu, who wrote grammar books in Amharic. She would say, in Amharic, stop speaking English. You need to respect the teacher, speak Amharic only, and stop whispering. And the girls would be like, oh, sorry. Okay. And they would start speaking Amharic.
Yes, I could relate to many of the points, especially I was listening to the audiobook with my daughter. We were coming back from her swim class, and then it was exactly the a part that absolutely applied to Rana and me. I usually try to speak with her in Farsi, and she always replies in English. And it
That's
was,
right.
and it was very interesting. It was, we were listening to a part, I think it was chapter 9 that we were listening to, and it was exactly this phenomenon
The
that
dynamic. Hmm.
the mom was speaking with the kid in their own language. I think it was Korean, and then the kid was
Yes,
answering in English. So
right.
it was so delicious. In chapter 8, you are offering some solutions. So can you tell me about the solutions you're offering?
Yes. So the book, is, as you mentioned, is not just about language, but language is a huge part of transmitting our culture. And I read a lot of research and books about bilingualism, and I interviewed some bilingualism experts, or trilingual speech therapists and researchers in psychology, including actually the professor up in Canada who came up with the idea, or with the research that showed that kids who are bilingual have better ability to focus and multitask, and the fact that older bilingual adults can stave off dementia and Alzheimer's for several years if they are bilingual. So, I mean, the tips are, it's very easy to speak of the tips. It's about implementing them. The most important thing, of course, is need to create the need for the child to speak that language. For example, if they speak just to us, they know we'll understand English, and they'll be like, okay, why should I try speaking, whatever language if I can get what I need just in English. The other thing that's really important, in addition to need, is exposure. Um, Being exposed to it. So just occasionally, for a few minutes, speaking that language is not enough. The child has to be exposed to it in the home, you know, preferably outside of the home and the community as well. Which I know is hard, especially when we sometimes are the only purveyors of that language and there's nobody else to speak it, right? To us.
Masha,
Yeah.
I'm gonna let our audience to basically learn about the other solutions
Yeah.
themselves by buying the book. How
Great.
about that?
It's all in there.
So if you really want to learn about what are the solutions that Masha, it's a research, very well done research. So if you want to learn about more solutions, you need to buy the book Parenting with an Accent. What are you leaving out of the script that you wish you could include and you are not including?
Um, well, it was very hard to. I had hours and hours of research, interviews, and obviously my own stories. It was hard to find the right balance because I didn't want it to be just about me. A lot of it was very painful to write about. My experiences with
What,
discrimination.
which give me some examples, at least one or
Well,
two examples.
sure, yeah. I mean, there was. I mean, I grew up. My family has experienced hostility for many generations for being Jewish in the former Soviet Union. So, denied work. I've, called names, like beaten
Yes,
a lot of
I know.
times. And so that was tough. Also, there's obviously, I described some of my experiences as a teenager adjusting to the country and really missing the only place I called home until I was 13. So that adjustment was fairly tricky for me. I described it a little bit. And from my conversations, it seems like many people, especially teenagers, as research actually shows, have a hard time adapting, obviously harder than kids and sometimes even emotionally harder than adults. And at the same time, um, obviously the book came out right before Russia invaded Ukraine. Um, I mean, I don't know how I can make any more clear the fact that I obviously
Honestly,
don't support the war in any way, and it's just
no,
terrible.
no. I mean, for
Yeah.
me, at least when I was reading the book, I really didn't make any connection.
Yeah.
between Russia and Russian culture and Ukraine. This is our way of, at least in the media, because we are so
Yeah.
bombarded by too many information that we are just swimming in misinformation. But honestly, for me, at least, sorry to interrupt you, but for me, was not Russia, was not Ukraine even, was this a parent's struggle of figuring out what to do to her beautiful culture and how she can teach this culture to her kids, and then what she learned, and what are the common struggles, common themes, that it was very teachable for me. These are the many things that I struggle myself. What are the themes? What are the commonalities between all the struggles?
So there were so many commonalities that I found that I wasn't really even expecting to find. I feel like the book was a learning opportunity for me for me the most as I was writing it. And just to give you an idea, there are 20 pages of small print of footnotes at the end. So
Yes.
I did quite a bit of kind of geeking out on the research and sources. I found several common threads. So the people I spoke to are obviously all from different countries. I think, what is it, like 16, 17 different languages other than English, or almost 18. So there was a huge number of linguistic groups and geographical areas that I tried to capture. Um, Obviously, every immigration story is different, but I did find some commonalities. One is that all of us really want to transmit something from our culture. For many people, it's, language. For some people, it's maybe honoring the family. For others, it's, the food or the holidays or the festivals. But whatever that might be, we often feel uneasy about our decisions, and sometimes even plagued with guilt about not doing enough, or depriving ourselves or our children of the American way of life if we do that. So it's always kind of a balancing act, at least for some time. But it's incredibly important for us to transmit some of it, and it's very emotional. The second thing is language. Transmitting language and teaching it to our kids is harder than I think most people realize. And those of us who are doing a good job or think they're doing a good job, they're probably doing a great job. So I think it's so important to recognize our successes, and it's a work in progress. But that tends to be another really difficult thing, to teach the language and make sure it sticks. Especially, and it's all different for everybody. I've heard some discussions, not in my book, that my kid just like is absolutely fluent in all those languages and we had no trouble at all. And okay, that's great, but that's not, I would say that's probably not the majority. We as parents have to make really conscious effort to make that happen. And the
Mhm.
third thing is, as immigrants, we tend to carry a lot of, don't want to overuse the word, but traumas, that we've inherited from our culture, from wars, from oppression that maybe our ancestors have experienced. The fact that the act of leaving is very traumatic. It's like losing a loved one in a way, especially if we lived a certain lifestyle and know a certain way of life, and we've had to abandon that. And sometimes dealing with discrimination and adaptation, and being an outsider, feeling like we don't fit in anywhere. That's also incredibly difficult. And a lot of those things we tend to not even think about, but they're with us. And I find that very healing, to be able to discuss it and to process it. And certainly even talking about it with people brought out a lot in them. I've had people follow up with me by email or by phone and add something else to their story or say how it's impacted them. Just the ability to talk about it. There's a great book I would also recommend, if I may, called The Ungrateful Refugee, by Gina Nayeri. She was born in Iran, and she talks about kind of that process of fitting in nonfiction and refugee crisis.
Mhm. Very good. I think I cut you off when you were talking about what you left out of the book.
Oh yes, um, maybe it's material for my next book. I think I really wanted to talk more about my own childhood and the things I loved, and my relatives, my family members, family stories. Um, and a lot of it was also, the trauma, the growing up um, in times when, the country was poor and controlled by central government. And, there are a lot of things I don't like about bringing up children in a way that sometimes, that's considered punishment is considered to be okay. Harsh punishment, harsh discipline. I think that's true for a lot of very traditional cultures. So that's not something that I appreciate necessarily. And I didn't go into it too much in my book, but that's something I try to, make different choices about as a parent here in America.
Mhm. Excellent. Very, very good. Is there what do are you working in any project in next work?
Right now I'm just working on essays, which have been quite kind of challenging, but I have some ideas, a couple ideas for books, but they're still crystallizing. Yeah.
What are you working on right now? Essay, you said?
Yes, a couple of essays, and a lot of them are also, personal essays about my childhood. There are some pieces about my family and obviously about Ukraine and the war. So it's been really difficult to write during this time in particular because my family is affected. But another thing I've been working on that's not a book is my daughter has been making. I taught her how to make friendship bracelets, macrame bracelets. Here's one example. And the first thing she said is, "I want to make those to help Ukraine." And so she's been making them for this Ukrainian nonprofit that works on the ground, and she's been raising money for their cause. I've been kind of
What
sending
is
them.
excellent. So what is do you would you comfortable to telling me your kid's name? Leah?
Well, Leah is the name of the book, yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. So
but
if you
it's actually my grandmother's name. This was a
okay,
way to honor my grandmother. So
I see.
it's not exact, but Leah, yeah. So she's 8 years old, and yeah, we're donating it to this wonderful nonprofit that I know. I have friends of friends that they're involved in it, and they're called the Ukraine Trust Chain. So she's already
Ukraine
raised
Trust Chain.
Trust Chain, yes, and they do amazing work on the ground for all volunteer run. Um, yes, she's raised $350 already, and we're working on some more bracelets. The
Excellent.
Ukrainian flag colors. So
Uh-huh.
that's kind
Uh-huh.
of in lieu of the book for now, just weaving bracelets instead of stories.
Excellent. Excellent. Where can we find you and the book? Do you have any social media handles?
Yes, so I'm on Twitter at Masha DC, which is spelled Masha DC, as in Washington DC, even though I don't live there anymore. I have a website, my first name, last name.com. There's my writing and some appearances that are coming up. MashaRumer. I think I'm also on Instagram that I started just a few months ago. My first name and last name, I
Mhm.
think. Yes.
Very good. Very good. Excellent. Stay put with me. You are watching and listening to Peace Mindedly, a podcast featuring peaceful bridge makers. For this hour, we were talking with Masha Rumer, author of Parenting with an Accent: How Immigrants Honor Their Heritage, Navigate Setbacks, and Chart New Paths for Their Children. It's a long subtitle, but I liked the subtitle because really helped me to imagine what I'm going to read in the book, and then made my heart warm because this is the kind of issues that I am dealing with myself as a mom. I know that many of my friends, immigrant, are dealing with. So if you are an immigrant mom who really want to pass on your heritage and your culture to your kids, there are some very good recommendations and to do things that you can do, as well as a story. It's not a guidebook to just give you in-depth information about how to go about. At the end of every program, we ask our guests to ask something meaningful about peace, kindness, and compassion. And here I'm going to ask Masha to tell me something about peace, kindness, and compassion, whatever you would like to share.
Peace. I think peace, kindness, and compassion starts at home. We teach it to our kids. In a way, I would say it's even more important than language and cultural transmission, is to teach them what's going on in the world and to, understand hostility, understand it to the best ability, bad treatment of people and of countries, and to stand up to it. So I think that starts at home, and it's really important to pass that on to them and to be able to treat each individual, see the beauty in each individual, and not to make blanket generalizations, because they can lead to problems in society and wars, as we're seeing. And obviously, I'm really hoping and praying that the war in Ukraine stops as soon as possible, and people there can live in peace.
Inshallah, as we say in Arabic. Thank you very much for the conversation. I appreciate. Parenting with an Accent is the book by Masha Rumer. Thank you, Masha.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely.